The hidden psychology behind their silence. The silence they never expected. Have you ever wondered why some people don't react when you finally walk away, only to completely fall apart weeks or even months later? At first, it makes no sense. While the empath cries, questions themselves, and grieves the relationship, the avoidant often appears calm. They continue with their routine, stay busy, and act as if nothing important has changed. Today, we'll uncover the hidden psychology behind why many avoidants struggle after an empath goes silent, why relief often turns into emotional confusion, and why they frequently realize the value of the relationship only after it's no longer available. Stay until the end, because the final insight explains why silence can become more powerful than 1,000 emotional conversations. Every relationship between an empath and an avoidant follows a pattern. The empath naturally seeks closeness. They communicate. They ask questions. They try to understand. When something feels wrong, they don't ignore it. They want to repair it. The avoidant often responds differently. When emotions become intense, distance feels safer than discussion. Instead of moving toward the conflict, they step away from it, not always because they don't care, but because closeness can feel overwhelming for a while. This creates a cycle that repeats itself again and again. The empath reaches out. The avoidant pulls back. The empath explains their feelings. The avoidant asks for space. After every disagreement, the empath is usually the first person to reconnect. They send the message. They make the call. They offer another chance. Over time, something important begins happening. Without either person fully realizing it, the avoidant slowly starts believing this pattern will never change. No matter how many times they withdraw, the empath will eventually come back. That expectation becomes part of the relationship itself. Difficult conversations can wait. Emotional accountability can wait. Apologies can wait, because somewhere in the back of their mind, they believe the connection isn't going anywhere. Then, one day, everything changes. The empath becomes emotionally exhausted, not because they stopped loving, but because they finally understand that love cannot survive when only one person keeps carrying the relationship. There is no dramatic goodbye, no attempt to prove a point, no final argument, only silence. At first, the avoidant barely notices. The pressure is gone. The difficult conversations disappear. No one is asking for reassurance. No one is asking them to open up. It almost feels like relief. But relief has a strange way of changing when it lasts too long. Because this silence isn't another pause. It's different. The messages don't come. The familiar pattern doesn't repeat, and for the first time, the avoidant begins facing a possibility they never truly considered. What if this time, the empath isn't coming back? That single question quietly changes everything. Because once the avoidant realizes the silence is real, the sense of relief slowly begins to disappear. In the next part, we'll explore why certainty turns into uncertainty, and why the human mind often values something most only after it's truly gone. When relief slowly becomes regret. At first, the silence feels exactly like what the avoidant thought they wanted. There are no emotionally charged conversations, no difficult questions, no pressure to explain feelings they don't fully understand themselves. Life becomes quieter. For someone who has always associated emotional intensity with stress, that quiet can feel surprisingly comfortable. Days pass. The phone stays silent. There are no late-night messages asking to talk. No attempts to fix the relationship. No emotional reminders that someone is waiting. The nervous system finally relaxes, and for a brief moment, the avoidant believes everything is fine. But human psychology has a fascinating way of revealing what truly matters. Relief only lasts as long as the mind believes something is temporary. The avoidant has experienced distance before. Arguments happened. The empath always came back. Another conversation always began. Another opportunity always appeared. So at first, this silence feels familiar. Nothing seems unusual. But as days quietly turn into weeks, something begins to change. The pattern breaks. The message never arrives. The empath doesn't check in. They don't ask for another chance. They don't try to explain themselves. Again, for the first time, the avoidant begins facing something they never prepared for. The possibility that this chapter has actually ended. That realization creates uncertainty, and uncertainty affects the human mind far more deeply than most people realize. Avoidants often feel safest when they believe they control emotional distance. If they need space, they step back. If they want connection, they can return later. That sense of control quietly becomes part of the relationship. But now, the control is gone. The empath is no longer waiting. The decision no longer belongs entirely to the avoidant. Suddenly, questions begin appearing. What if they're truly moving on? What if they've stopped hoping? What if someone else is giving them the emotional safety I never could? These questions don't always appear overnight. Sometimes they arrive while driving home from work. Sometimes while scrolling through old messages. Sometimes during quiet evenings, when there are no distractions left. Little by little, memories begin replacing relief. The avoidant starts remembering conversations they ignored, acts of kindness they barely acknowledged, moments when the empath reached out, despite being deeply hurt. At the time, those moments seemed ordinary. Now they feel surprisingly significant. The human brain often assigns greater value to something only after it's no longer available. That's exactly what begins happening here. The absence itself becomes emotionally louder than the relationship ever was. No argument can compete with unanswered silence. No explanation carries the same weight as someone who simply stops trying. The avoidant may still appear perfectly calm on the outside. They continue working, meeting friends, following the same routine, but internally, something has shifted. Their mind has stopped managing the empath's presence. Now it's trying to understand the empath's absence. And those are two completely different psychological experiences. Without realizing it, the avoidant has entered the first stage of emotional collapse, not through heartbreak alone, but through uncertainty. Because uncertainty has a way of reopening every emotion that distance once kept hidden. But uncertainty is only the beginning. As the silence continues, something even more powerful starts happening. Without the empath's constant presence, the avoidant loses the distraction they unknowingly relied on. And that's when buried emotions finally begin rising to the surface. The silence that forces them to face themselves. As the weeks pass, something unexpected begins to happen. The silence no longer feels empty. It becomes impossible to ignore. At first, the avoidant tries to continue life as usual. They focus on work. They spend time with friends. They stay busy. They convince themselves they're moving forward. From the outside, everything appears normal. But inside, the mind has quietly started a process it can no longer control. Without the empath constantly reaching out, something important disappears. The distraction. For months, or sometimes years, the relationship itself kept the avoidant focused on external situations. When conflict appeared, they focused on escaping it. When emotions became intense, they focused on creating distance. When difficult conversations happened, they focused on ending the discomfort as quickly as possible. But now, there is nothing left to escape. No messages to ignore. No conversations to postpone. No emotional pressure demanding immediate attention. Only silence. And silence has a remarkable effect on the human mind. It creates space. Space that slowly fills with thoughts the avoidant spent years pushing aside. Random memories begin appearing without warning. A conversation from months ago suddenly feels important. A simple text message they ignored now carries a completely different meaning. They remember moments when the empath asked for honesty instead of perfection, when they simply wanted reassurance, when they weren't asking for grand gestures, only emotional presence. At the time, those requests felt overwhelming. Now they seem painfully reasonable. The avoidant starts replaying old situations again and again, not because they want to suffer. They appear quietly, late at night, during a long drive, while hearing a familiar song, or while passing a place that suddenly brings back a forgotten memory. The silence gives those memories room to grow louder. Along with them comes something many avoidants rarely allow themselves to feel: regret. Not dramatic regret, not immediate heartbreak, but small realizations that slowly become impossible to ignore. They begin seeing the relationship from a different perspective. Moments they once dismissed now reveal hidden meaning. Acts of kindness they took for granted now seem incredibly rare. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant begins understanding what the empath was actually offering. Not constant attention, not control, not emotional pressure, but consistency, patience, understanding, and a willingness to stay, even when things became difficult. That's when another realization begins to emerge. Finding someone willing to love beyond your defenses is far less common than finding someone willing to walk away. The empath wasn't simply asking for more. They were trying to build something lasting, and now that opportunity may no longer exist. The silence has changed from absence into reflection, and reflection has a way of exposing truths that years of arguments never could. But the deepest part of the avoidance journey is still ahead. Because once regret begins to grow, another painful realization follows. They may have lost not just the relationship, but the one person who understood them better than anyone else. In the next part, we'll explore why that realization often becomes the true beginning of an avoidance emotional collapse, when they finally realize what they lost. By the time an avoidant reaches this stage, something has fundamentally changed. The silence is no longer just the absence of messages. It has become a constant reminder of what used to exist. For weeks, their mind has replayed old memories, questioned past decisions, and searched for explanations. Now another realization quietly begins to emerge. The empath wasn't simply another relationship. They were one of the very few people who chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. Most people don't repeatedly try to understand someone who keeps withdrawing after one or two disappointments. They protect themselves and move on. But empaths often see beyond behavior. Instead of asking, "Why are they acting this way?" they ask, "What pain could be causing this?" That difference changes everything. The empath wasn't trying to win arguments. They were trying to understand the person behind the emotional walls. They offered patience when others offered judgment. They searched for healing instead of blame. And because they continued showing up, the avoidant slowly began treating that loyalty as something permanent, not intentionally, simply because it became familiar. When something is always there, the human mind rarely stops to appreciate its value. Only after it's gone does its importance become fully visible. That's exactly what begins happening now. The avoidant starts comparing new interactions with the connection they once had. Conversations feel different. People seem less patient. New relationships often move on more quickly when emotional distance appears. The understanding that once seemed ordinary suddenly feels incredibly rare. Little by little, another uncomfortable truth surfaces. The empath accepted parts of them that very few people ever would. Not because the relationship was perfect. It wasn't. There were misunderstandings, moments of frustration, long periods of emotional distance. But despite those challenges, the empath kept believing that growth was possible now. The avoidant begins asking a painful question. Will I ever find someone willing to understand me that deeply again? There is no easy answer, because relationships built on genuine empathy are uncommon. Real emotional patience cannot be replaced overnight. As this realization settles in, the emotional balance inside the relationship quietly shifts. For years, the avoidant controlled the distance. If they needed space, they stepped away. If they wanted to reconnect later, they expected the door to remain open. Now that door is no longer theirs to open. The empath has stopped waiting. They have redirected their energy toward healing instead of hoping, toward self-respect instead of self-sacrifice, toward building a peaceful life instead of chasing emotional certainty. This transformation can be deeply unsettling for the avoidant, not because the empath became cruel, but because they became emotionally independent. The person who once fought for every conversation is no longer trying to convince anyone to stay. The person who once waited patiently has started moving forward. And perhaps the hardest part isn't watching the empath leave. It's realizing they may never return as the same person again. Growth changes people. The version who accepted endless emotional distance no longer exists. In their place stands someone who finally understands that love should never require abandoning yourself. For many avoidants, this is the moment when the weight of the loss truly becomes impossible to ignore.